All right. Today we're going to be learning about fruit anatomy. By the end of today's notes, we're going to really understand all the major parts of a fruit, and we're going to get into a lot of the different kinds of fruit that exist. Okay, so to begin, what are fruits? Okay, so fruits are one of the major plant organ systems. When we look at the first three in this list, root, stems, and leaves, these are really vegetative plant organ systems that exist to extend the growth of the plant. Flowers and fruits exist for reproductive purposes, so they are produced by plants with the intent of collecting genetic material from other unrelated plants, producing seeds, and then getting those seeds dispersed throughout the environment. We'll talk a lot more about seed dispersal in a minute. Um, One of the most important things to know about fruits from a plant anatomy perspective is that they develop from the ovary of the flower. So a fruit is the ripened ovary. The ovary doesn't really change identity; it's still an ovary. But certainly when they are fully developed and mature, we typically refer to them as fruits rather than ovaries. You'll notice here at the bottom that I say that fruits are the ripened ovaries of a plant's flowers, except for when they are not. We will see that there are situations where plants have the ability to turn non-ovary tissues into fruit-like tissues as well, and we'll see several examples. So, function of fruits. I briefly mentioned this on the last slide. The function of fruits is to aid in seed dispersal. Dispersal is the process of spreading a plant's seeds. And there are a number of reasons why plants might like to do this. First and foremost, a mature plant does not want all of its offspring to germinate right where it is, because its offspring will become its competitors. And if its offspring become its competitors by having germinated right next to the mother plant and competing for things like space and light and water and resources, that actually decreases the survivability fitness of not just the parent plant but also all of its offspring. Um, the other issue is if a plant only has the ability to drop its seeds where it is, the the plant really can't spread to new habitats. It can't really expand its range, and it's not really going to be evolutionarily successful. So the plants that have been the most successful in the game of evolution have been the angiosperms, the flowering plants which produce fruits. And that's because fruits have some major advantages. They can manipulate the environment in ways that help seeds get away from the mother plant. A couple different ways that plants recruit, not I shouldn't say recruit, but um, accomplish this is by attracting and rewarding animal seed dispersers. An animal can come and eat the fruit, ingest the seeds, and then walk away, fly away, run away, and defecate the seeds out farther away from the mother plant. Some fruits have spines or burrs or barbs that allow them to hitchhike, so they can get caught on your socks or on the fur of a dog or in the feathers of a bird and get carried away. And then eventually the animal will groom itself or preen its feathers and remove those hitchhiking bird fruits from their fur or plumage. Um, Many fruits have wings, and that allows them to glide or fly away. It's not true flight because they're not capable of gaining altitude, um, and there's no power involved. But certainly, we're all familiar with the helicopter-like seeds of maples that help those seeds on a strong, windy day blow away from their mother tree so that they can germinate elsewhere. Many fruits have a parachute called a pappus. We're going to see those in dandelions and thistles and other species such as salsify or milkweed. By having a tuft of hairs, that fruit can catch the wind and be blown away to new places. Some fruits are buoyant, A great example that we'd all be familiar with would be coconuts. When you buy a coconut at the store, you're really just getting the seed inside of the coconut. If you look at a coconut while it's growing on a palm tree, on a coconut palm, on maybe a beach somewhere, the actual fruit is this big, kind of spongy, woody fruit that has a lot of trapped air in it. So when that coconut is ripe, it contains a single seed. When that coconut is ripe, it drops to the sand on the beach. The tide can come in, carry that coconut out to sea, and that thick, woody, spongy fruit that covers the coconut helps it float along on the ocean. Um, Coconuts are unusual in that they're very, very tolerant of salt, and so coconut seeds can actually germinate while the fruit is floating on the ocean. And then when that germinated seed and its, kind of woody husk or fruit that surrounds the seed washes up on another beach, that coconut can root in. But without that kind of woody, spongy fruit on the outside, the coconut would not stand a chance of getting from island to island to island. There are some fruits which are capable of exploding and flinging or blasting their seeds away from the plant that produced them. They're really good examples. One of my favorite examples from my childhood was a plant called vetch. Vetch grew as a weed in our front yard when I lived in Washington, and as a child, it was so fun to touch the pods because as soon as they dried out and turned black, if with the slightest touch, the pods would kind of spring open and flick the seeds all over the yard, which was very fun to watch. And then there are also seeds that use jet propulsion. There are fruits, I should say, that use propulsion to disperse their seeds. So in these cases, we have fruits which the plant essentially pumps full of water to a very high pressure, and then something splits open and the seeds get squirted out and blasted away from the plant. Whenever we look at fruits, we can expect to see the same layers or the same components of a fruit in almost all fruits. We call these three layers altogether the pericarp. So the pericarp is just the ovary wall, and it's composed of three predictable tissue layers: endocarp, which is the inner fruit; mesocarp, which is the middle fruit; and the exocarp, which is the outer fruit. And if you're familiar with these root words, you'll know that endo means inside, meso means middle, and exo means outside. You may be familiar with an insect exoskeleton, which is the outer skeleton that insects possess, and also other arthropods such as lobsters or crayfish or crabs. So these are pretty easy to remember if you know what the root words mean. Carp means fruit. When we look at an example like this peach, we can see that there are three distinct layers to this peach. In the center of the peach, we have a seed, and then we have our first fruit layer, which is the endocarp. And in peaches, the endocarp actually has a woody texture. The different layers of the ovary wall can develop in different ways in different species of plants. Some species of plants have a pericarp that is entirely fleshy. So the endocarp, the mesocarp, and the exocarp will all be fleshy. Sometimes all three layers will be woody, or maybe one layer will be leathery. So there's a lot of different ways that the development can occur, but we still have three layers always. So the endocarp in a peach, the innermost layer of fruit, is actually woody, and we typically call that a pit, or sometimes a stone. The next layer of the fruit is the mesocarp, or the middle fruit, and that makes up, in a peach, the majority of the flesh of the fruit. And then in a peach, we also have this thin outer layer called the exocarp, or the outer fruit. So we see that there are three defined layers of tissue that make up the pericarp, which is the wall of the ovary. The funiculus is a very fun word to say, first and foremost. But additionally, the funiculus is valuable to know because it's of the part of the fruit that supplies water, food, and mineral nutrients to the developing seed. And Plants need to supply water, food, and mineral nutrients to their developing seed for a couple of reasons. Um, First of all, after the egg cell within the ovule has been fertilized by the sperm cells, which were delivered by the pollen through the pollen tube, the embryo inside of the seed starts to develop. And the embryo, in order to develop properly, will need water, food, and mineral nutrients. Additionally, flowering plants, being seed plants, store sometimes significant amounts of food to help that embryo have the food resources it needs to get a good start once it's dispersed. So the plant is developing an embryo and storing food for that embryo to power the germination process inside that seed. If you're familiar with pregnancy, you're probably familiar with the umbilical cord, which is how um, mammals supply nutrients to their developing embryos and fetuses. You could think of the funiculus as the plant equivalent of an umbilical cord, because it's helping the child of the plant, the embryo within the seed, and the food store called the endosperm um, develop and grow. Okay, so when we look at the inside of a fruit, we often see some chambers and partitions between those chambers. And you may have wondered why. You may also not have wondered why. If you have or haven't, we're going to find out either way today. Um, when we look at the development of a pistil, right? A pistil can be composed of one or more carpels. And the carpel is basically a modified spore-bearing leaf that got folded up along one seam, and serves to protect the developing ovules so that they can become seeds and get off to a better start than if they were just dispersed as spores the way ferns do. So um, often plants want to produce more seeds per flower. And one of the ways they can do this is by duplicating or producing more carpels within each flower. We're familiar maybe with flowers often having numerous stamens, but often we miss the fact that we can actually have multiple carpels within a flower as well. And depending on the species, the carpels may be separate or they may be together. When we see fruits that are segmented inside, that gives us a clue that at one point we had multiple carpels and they've fused together to produce one larger ovary. The chambers themselves are referred to as locules. Each locule represents the ovary chamber of one single carpel, and the walls that divide the different the different locules are called septa. And you may be familiar with the singular version of that word, the septum. You may be familiar with the nasal septum, which is the divider between your two nostrils that goes all the way back up into your nasal cavity. Um, so the locules are the chambers in which we find the seeds. Each one represents the ovary of just one of the carpels. And then the septa, those are the walls which are dividing each locule from each other. The pedicel, this is a little bit of a review from our unit on flowers. The pedicel is the stalk which bears an individual flower, and that flower will develop into a fruit. And often what we see on these fruits is that the pedicel continues to be part of that process because all the water and food and mineral nutrients that allow the fruit to develop are supplied through the pedicel to the developing fruit. Many of our most popular um, fruits are sold with the pedicel still attached. For example, tomatoes often still have a little stalk on top. Bananas have the stalk on the top. That's the pedicel. Apples have a pedicel attached. That's the stalk that bore the flower, and it continues to be part of our story as we move from flower to fruit, because the fruit needs to be supplied resources to develop. We also often see the calyx continue to play a role even as the fruit develops. The calyx is composed of the sepals of the flower. And if we look at the tomato flowers in the top picture, we see these little modified leaves just outside of our petals. And the sepals, help protect that flower bud before it opens. However, they continue to develop as the tomato becomes larger. And when you pick your tomatoes, they tend to still have that calyx intact. It's composed of 5 sepals in most cases, and it just sits there right at the base of the pedicel in kind of a typical flower. Um, we may also remember the term inflorescence from our previous unit on flowers. After an inflorescence has been pollinated, once all of the flowers of the inflorescence have been pollinated and begin to develop into fruits, the name of that structure changes and we start to refer to it instead as an infructescence, which is very fun to say, infructescence. And that's basically just to signify that we've gone from the floral stage to the fruiting stage within that particular structure. Um, This is something, this is a bit of an older terminology feature here, um, but I think it's valuable to be aware. You might notice that I've got 2 pictures in the bottom of this slide that are upside down. We're going to ignore those for a second and we're going to come back to them in a minute. I put them upside down on purpose. When we talk about superior and inferior ovaries, the word superior or super, you can think about a superpower. That's a power that is above and beyond what a normal person could do, right? Whereas inferior, if you were to say that something is of inferior quality, maybe a loaf of bread, that would mean that it is of below normal quality. Um, so superior really means above and inferior means below. One of the reasons these 2 terms have fallen out of favor is that they often are a little bit confusing when we get to the fruit stage, because often the orientation of the ovary changes as it swells and ripens because it becomes heavy. And so a flower that maybe originally pointed up is now pointing down, and these terms above and below can get kind of confusing. Um, I'm going to start with superior ovary. When we look at this diagram with a blue background, we can see that this purple flower underneath says hypogynous. And we talked about how hypo means below and gyno means female. So that means below the female portion of the flower. So that would be floral whorl 4, which is composed of the pistil or carpels. And we can see the ovary of that pistil um, is on kind of the top of the flower with all of the structures below it, which is why it would be hypogynous below the female. This is thought of often as like our prototypical or most basic floral structure. And in this case, because the ovary sits on top of all other floral whorls, we would describe this ovary or could describe this ovary as superior. It is on top of all of the other floral whorls. And that's the situation we see with a tomato. When you look at the tomato, the calyx or the sepals are directly attached at the pedicel. So that's the bottom of the flower. Um, and that would match up with our hypogynous flower with a superior ovary. Um, in a superior ovary, the floral whorls are free of the ovary. There's no attachment of those structures to the ovary wall. Moving over to the other extreme of our diagram, we see a pink flower which is labeled epigynous. Epi means on top of, and gyno is female, right? So that means on top of the female flower. And in this case, we see that it would appear that our floral whorls, our calyx or the sepals, our corolla or the petals, and our andrecium or the stamens are all attached above the ovary. What's really happening here in these situations is the tissues of these four floral whorls have actually grown over and around and engulfed the entire ovary, which means that the outer walls of the fruit are actually composed of these fused stamen, corolla, calyx, and receptacle tissues um, surrounding the fruit. So when we look at an apple is a really good example of a plant that has an inferior ovary. We see that unlike the tomato, the pedicel and the calyx are on the opposite ends. So that gives us a clue that all of the other floral whorls had to be kind of stretched out and wrapped around the entire ovary, which is why we get them on top. And in fact, when we look inside of an apple, you can see that we know from eating apples that there's a leathery endocarp or core surrounding the seeds. Then we get this softer tissue outside of that that's not as sweet, that's also part of the core. And then this little green line that we see through the middle of the flesh, that's actually the exocarp. The majority of the flesh of the apple is actually not the ovary. So we would say an apple has an inferior ovary. Um, it's got the floral whorls engulfing over the top of the ovary, whereas a tomato would have a superior ovary, and the um, ovary kind of sits on top of and free of any of the other floral whorls. You don't need to really pay that much attention to this slide. We're going to go through all of these different fruit types on the upcoming slides. I've just got them organized here in a nice way in case you want to take a photo or you want to reference this in the notes. We're basically going to look at several different kind of categories of fruits, and then some categories within those categories, and some specific fruit types as we move forward. The first fruits, and probably the fruits we're most familiar with that we will discuss today, are the fleshy fruits. So fleshy fruits are those with a soft or thickened, juicy, sweet, or fatty pericarp layers. Remember, the pericarp, that's the ovary wall. It's composed of the endocarp, mesocarp, and exocarp. You might be wondering, what on earth are you talking about with fatty pericarp? What kinds of fruits are fatty? But if you've ever had an olive or an avocado, um, that's a situation where a plant is choosing to attract animals by providing a snack that is kind of oily or fatty, rather than one that is sugary. Different animals have different preferences for flavors or different types of nutrients. And so different plant species can basically, evolutionarily, because the plants don't really have a brain, so they don't really choose, but evolutionarily, they can um, select whatever type of nutrient is the most attractive to the animals which disperse their seeds. And that's one of the reasons why we see different nutritional content in different types of fruits. So these fleshy fruits have soft, thickened, juicy, sweet, or fatty pericarp layers. And most of these fleshy fruits are eaten by animals. And the seeds are dispersed in the dung or manure or feces of those animals. And I've got here a discussion question. What are some of the advantages of having seeds dispersed by animals? Give you a second to think about that, and then we'll discuss it together. What are some of the advantages of having seeds dispersed by animals specifically? This is a bit of an interesting question because plants that produce fleshy fruits are expending a lot of resources in order to develop these fleshy fruits. They're basically, you could think of them as wasting a lot of sugar and fat that they could have dedicated toward leaf growth or stem growth or root growth. But animals do provide several advantages. One advantage is that animals move. Animals can easily carry seeds far away. Additionally, by recruiting an animal to move your seeds, You can sometimes, as a plant, have a say in where that seed goes. For example, if an animal likes to spend a lot of time resting in the shade, and you are a species of plant that likes to germinate in the shade, then recruiting an animal which spends a lot of time resting in the shade and is likely to defecate in the shade might help your seedlings survive. Um, or, maybe you're a mistletoe and you have seeds which germinate on a tree branch and then plug into the tree and start to siphon off nutrients. You'll probably want a bird to eat your fruits and then defecate them on a tree branch so that your seeds can get up on a tree branch, germinate, plug into the tree, and start parasitizing the tree. So there are a couple advantages there. Another big advantage is stomach acid. So acid might not seem like the most friendly thing to a seed, but it certainly can be. In animal stomachs, we typically find hydrochloric acid, which is produced by the stomach lining. And hydrochloric acid is an extremely strong acid. It's got a pH that's extremely low, about 2, which means that basically almost nothing can survive in terms of bacteria or fungus. So if an animal consumes the fruit of a plant and then digests it, the seeds are essentially disinfected by that very strongly acidic solution in the animal's stomach. One of the biggest enemies of germinating seeds is fungus. So if you can get an animal to disinfect your seeds before they're dropped on the soil, that's ideal. Speaking of dropping on the soil, another major advantage of having your seeds dispersed by animals is that they're deposited in a little pile of manure. Um, Animal dung is typically very high in nutrients, especially things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are nutrients which are essential for plant growth. So if a plant can recruit an animal to eat it, it's going to guarantee that its seeds are deposited somewhere with a little dollop of fertilizer, which is going to help them get a good head start. Um, I don't need to provide examples of fleshy fruits. I'm sure we're all familiar. Everything from apples, bananas, blueberries, squash, tomatoes, etc. Um, in the wild, there are many, many different species of animals which disperse fruits, and certainly our ancestors would have dispersed the seeds within fruits. But we don't do that so much anymore. But certainly the plants which we find tasty, we have still spread their seeds all over the world. So the plants are still successful, even though we're collecting the seeds now before we eat them. So simple fruits are the first type we're going to look at, or I should say, a kind of a category or definition that we're going to look at. Simple fruits contain one or more seeds, and they form from a single ovary from a single flower. If we go back and we talk about carpels and pistils and how there can be different numbers per flower, simple fruits are those that contain a single pistil. Even if there were multiple carpels, if all those carpels are fused together to form just one single pistil, then we will have one single ovary within that flower that will develop into a fruit. Some good examples of simple fruits could be an orange, a squash, a grape, or a peach. They only have one pistil. There's only one ovary within one flower, and that develops into a fruit. The first type of simple fleshy fruit we'll be looking at today is a berry. A berry is a simple fleshy fruit containing one or more seeds in which the pericarp is entirely fleshy. Remember that our pericarp has 3 layers: the endocarp, or the inner fruit, the mesocarp, or the middle fruit, and the exocarp, or the outer fruit. In all berries, all 3 layers are entirely fleshy. This can lead to some pretty interesting fruits being botanically classified as berries. One thing I'd like to stress is that often there is a difference between the culinary definition and the botanical definition. When we think of berries in a culinary or cooking context, we tend to think of very small, brightly colored fruits. This is not the case botanically. Even very large fruits like a pumpkin are technically a type of berry. Um, in the images that I have on the right hand of the screen, in this top picture with the leaves, we see these little red fruits. These are actually the berries of Coffea arabica, the coffee plant. And each coffee cherry, as they call them, contains one single coffee bean. So coffee is a great example of a plant which produces berries. A tomato is a berry as well because all of the pericarp layers are fleshy. In a grape, all of the pericarp layers are fleshy, so it's a berry. In a persimmon, which is this orange fruit, um, all the pericarp layers are fleshy. In a kiwi, in a banana, in an avocado, all the pericarp layers are kind of soft and fleshy, and so we would consider all of these to be berries. I have provided a contrast between a domestic banana and a wild banana here, in case you're not familiar with wild bananas. You'll see that the wild banana is much smaller and it's packed full of very hard black seeds. Banana seeds are so hard you'll chip your teeth if you try to chew them up. So the fact that we've got seedless bananas today is pretty cool, and we'll talk about that a little bit later about how we get seedless bananas. Um, our next type of fleshy fruit we'll be looking at is a pepo. A pepo is a type of berry with a hard, leathery rind. So for example, when we look at a pumpkin like we have in the top, the rind is still soft, it's not woody, but it has a distinct texture compared to the rest of the flesh. Um, it's hard, it's leathery, it's often kind of waxy and helps retain moisture. On the bottom, we have two different kinds of melons. We've got a red-seeded melon, which is a type of watermelon, and then we've got a honeydew melon, and those are both examples of pepos. Another example would be a cucumber. Um, the pepo fruit type is characteristic of the family Cucurbitaceae, which are also called cucurbits. So that includes um, um, squashes, pumpkins, melons, cucumbers. They're almost all vining plants with small yellow flowers. So pepo is a specialized type of berry. That's another one of our simple fleshy fruits. The next simple fleshy fruit we'll look at is the Hesperidium. This is a really interesting word if you've ever heard of the Hesperides. The Hesperides were, in Greek mythology, some women who were dedicated to guarding this tree with golden fruit. And I am blanking on, what myths that's part of, but that name was then applied to a particular type of fruit because citrus tend to be or are often gold, orange, or yellow in color. So a Hesperidium is a type of berry with an oily, leathery rind and multiple locules. So um, if you've ever peeled an orange and you've deliberately folded the skin over and squeezed it, you can actually watch tiny little sprays of oil burst from the skin, these little pockets in the skin of the orange. And that's a defining characteristic of a Hesperidium. We also see that our fruit is divided into many, many locules with septa or dividers between each locule. And you might be thinking, but you said that each locule was a chamber. Why then are the chambers or the locules of a Hesperidium full of pulp? And the reason is that the little fluid-filled sacs inside of each locule um, basically are little hairs. So plants have the ability to produce tissues called trichomes, which are little hairs, and we often see them on leaves and stems in order to maybe protect them from insects or the cold. In this case, we've got little hairs which are inflated with juice, and they've basically filled up the entire volume of the chamber or locule. But we can still see the septa or the dividers between each locule which tells us that at one point these plants decided to fuse together numerous carpels to make one large pistil with one big ovary. Examples of plants that produce a Hesperidium type fruit are all of our plants in the genus Citrus. That would include lemons, limes, oranges. There are several different kinds: citron, calamandan, pomelo, mandarins, etc. And also kumquats, which are not in the genus Citrus, but they're closely related enough that they can actually be hybridized with citrus. Fun fact, if you're not familiar with kumquats, they actually they have a sweet skin and very, very tart flesh. So kind of the opposite of what you would expect from something like a mandarin orange. I've actually had kumquats, and the skin actually tastes a lot better than the flesh. The flesh is very, very tart, but the skin is sweet, and so you have to actually eat them whole in order for them to taste good. Our next type of simple fleshy fruit is a drupe. A drupe is a simple fleshy fruit containing a single seed enclosed in a thickened woody endocarp called a pit. So remembering that we have three layers to our pericarp. We have the endocarp or the inner fruit, the mesocarp or the middle fruit, and the exocarp, which is the outer fruit. When we look at a peach, the pit which surrounds the seed is actually a layer of fruit. A lot of people think that the pit itself is the seed, and that is not correct. It contains a seed because it's actually a layer of the fruit that the plant has decided to develop in a way such that it becomes woody. Some good examples of drupes would include the stone fruits of the genus Prunus. That includes plums, peaches, cherries, choke cherries, apricots, almonds, etc. And you might say almonds, that's not a stone fruit, but if you look at this picture in the bottom left, you can see this dry peach-like flesh which is splitting off of the underlying pit. And if we were to crack open that pit, we would find an almond because that's an almond tree. Almonds and peaches are actually very, very, very closely related. They're some of the most closely related species within the genus Prunus. An avocado is an interesting thought experiment here. So, is an avocado a drupe? Why or why not? When we look at the definition of a drupe, we might initially think yes, because the avocado is a simple fleshy fruit containing a single seed. Where we go wrong is that the seed is not enclosed in a thickened woody endocarp. There is no pit. We can count the pericarp layers of an avocado quite easily. If we start at the outside with the exocarp or the outer fruit, that would be the green skin of our avocado. The mesocarp or middle fruit is also relatively easy to identify. We have a kind of medium green, kind of a thin medium green layer of flesh that's right underneath the skin that corresponds to the mesocarp. And then the endocarp or inner fruit of an avocado is this kind of pale, creamy colored flesh that makes up the majority of the volume of the avocado. And then within that, we have a seed. But the seed notably does not have a thick woody pit protecting it. It's just a single seed. So an avocado is not a drupe. Accessory fruits. So this is where we talk about fruits which develop from non-ovary tissue. So rather than see the typical endocarp, mesocarp, exocarp tissues that we normally are expecting in a fruit, we're going to see weird stuff. So if you've ever had hibiscus tea, or sometimes it's called roselle, or in Spanish, flor de Jamaica, in this top left picture, in the top left picture, we can actually see the ripened fruits of the roselle, or tea hibiscus. And these kind of taste like cranberries, and they're used to make a really refreshing summer beverage. But when we look at them, the fleshy portion is actually kind of a ripened fleshy calyx. The ovary is contained within, but the calyx actually makes the majority of the fruit. When we look at something like a cashew, in the bottom right corner. We see the cashew fruit at the very, very bottom. It's a hard um, shell it's a hard, dry shell of fruit that actually covers each seed. And then we have this bulbous looking kind of red or yellow structure above. It goes from yellow to red as it ripens. And that actually represents the stalk, the pedicel that is supplying resources to the developing seeds within the fruit. And what cashews have decided to do is rather than develop a fleshy pericarp or fruit layers, they develop a fleshy pedicel or fruit stalk in order to attract animals to come consume that fruit. Strawberries are another good example of a species with an accessory fruit. They actually ripen the receptacle. So the receptacle is kind of the base of the flower that all of the floral whorls are anchored to. And the strawberry decides to grow the receptacle very large. But the actual fruits themselves are these dry little we'll talk about them later, but there are these dry little coverings around each seed, and that's why we see the seeds on the outside of a strawberry. Technically, the seeds are still inside of each of these little fruits that stipple the outside of the strawberry. The flesh of the strawberry itself is actually from that receptacle tissue, which is, like I said, that foundation to which all the other floral whorls are anchored. Another good example in this picture that's kind of off by itself to the left at the bottom is a wintergreen, and you can actually see the tips of the sepals on the butt end of the fruit. You can see that there are 5 sepals, and those sepals, or the calyx, once again, has swollen and become this fleshy fruit, and we can actually see that the ovary is kind of inside. It's tucked inside of that ripened set of sepals or calyx. And it's still fleshy itself, but we've got this extra layer of fleshy calyx on the outside. So plants can really make a fruit out of almost anything that they want, and often they'll use other parts of the flower in order to increase the appeal of the fruit to animal seed dispersers. One of the most common types of fleshy accessory fruits that we're going to see are pomes. So an apple is a great example of a pome. And when we talked about plants that have an inferior ovary, um, a lot of them we would classify as pomes. Not all of them, but many of them we would classify as pomes. So when we look at the apple, in this top picture, the dotted lines that run through the apple um, are showing the boundaries of the actual pericarp, the actual endocarp, mesocarp, exocarp layers of the apple. Everything beyond that is accessory receptacle tissue, which has and tissue from the other floral whorls, which has basically been wrapped around and over the top of the ovary, engulfing the ovary in tissue that isn't actually true ovary wall. And that's one of the reasons why we see the sepals, or the leaves which protect the bud. We see them on the um, in this image, the top of the apple, or you might be familiar with it as the bud of the apple based on the way we typically position apples. Um, but that's why we don't find the sepals adjacent to the pedicel like we might normally expect. Some common examples of pomes would be apples, pears. If you've ever had really old-fashioned roses growing in your garden, roses will produce a fruit that's called a rose hip, and they actually make a really good tea, which is high in vitamin C. A rose hip is another example of a pome. Mexican hawthorn is a really kind of interesting pome that's used to make a delicious holiday beverage in Mexico that's called ponche. And then in this bottom picture, we've got a loquat, and we can see that that loquat, just like an apple, has that leathery core surrounding these seeds. This layer of accessory tissue that engulfs the ovary in a pome fruit is called a hypanthium. And that's made of receptacle or calyx tissue or tissue from the other floral whorls, and that makes up the majority of the tissue, the edible fleshy tissue of a pome fruit. Um, We're now moving on from simple fruits. Remember, simple fruits had only one ovary from one flower that ripened and became a fruit. We're seeing a change from that. We're seeing not just one ovary anymore. So in an aggregate fruit, there are several separate ovaries in a single flower that after pollination will fuse to become a single fruit. So a great example of this phenomenon are blackberries. If we look in the top left corner, we can see these beautiful white flowers of a blackberry. And if you look in the very center of those flowers in floral whorl 4, we'll see a bunch of little green spikes, and those are the individual pistils of a blackberry flower. The pistils are not all united together. They're not fused into one structure. They're all kind of this little tuft of pistils within the blackberry flower. After pollination, each individual pistil will develop into its own fruit. It'll produce its own ovary. And what happens is all of the individual ovaries of each individual pistil from the blackberry flower then develop into their own little fruitlet. So when we look at the blackberry, each kind of lobe or bump of the blackberry developed from one single pistil. And often when you go blackberry picking or raspberry picking, you'll see that there's a little hair on the end of each kind of globule of that fruit. And each of those little hairs is a dried up it's a dried up style and stigma from back when that ovary was part of a pistil in a flower. Another example that I provided on the right side are sugar apples, which are a tropical fruit. They kind of have a fruit down below, which you can see has this cone of individual pistils. And as the fruit matures, all of those pistils fuse together to produce one larger fruit. Our aggregate fruits can also be defined or further described by what type of simple fruit makes up each fruitlet. For example, a blackberry is actually an aggregate of drupelets. If you've ever tried to chew up a blackberry, the seeds are quite hard, and that's because each seed is actually covered in a small woody endocarp. So each tiny little fruitlet within the aggregate fruit that is a blackberry is actually a tiny little drupe, kind of like a peach. You could also have an aggregate of berries or any other number of aggregates of any other fruit type. Multiple fruits are very easy to confuse with aggregate fruits. Some of them even look similar, but their developmental origin is quite different. To explain multiple fruits, I think one of the best examples to start with is a pineapple. If we look at the image in the bottom left, we will see a pineapple inflorescence that is in bloom. So this is a stalk bearing many flower buds of the pineapple plant. At this point, it is not yet a fruit. It's just a bunch of flower buds on a stalk. And you can see that the flowers kind of peek out from underneath each scale or each bract. And as the flowers peek out from underneath each bract, they bloom, they're pollinated, the flower dries out. You might notice in this image that the flowers at the very bottom have already bloomed and are dried up and brown, and that we've got fresh new flowers popping out at the top. This is one of the reasons why pineapples tend to be sweeter in the bottom half. If you've ever bought a pineapple from the store and cut it up, the bottom flesh tends to be sweeter because those ovaries were pollinated sooner and began to develop into fruit sooner, and so they accumulated more sugars over the lifetime of the fruit. Once the ovaries are all pollinated, they begin to develop and swell um, as the ovaries take on more water and sugars from the plant. So when we look to the picture in the bottom right-hand side where we have a ripe pineapple, all of the bracts that originally protected the flowers have kind of stretched out and filled out, and the entire inflorescence has become one giant fruit. that develops from multiple flowers. An aggregate fruit develops from a single flower. A multiple fruit develops from multiple flowers, um, all fusing together their ovaries to become a giant fruit. Another good example are mulberries. When we look at the top two images, we see a mulberry flower on the left and mulberry fruits on the right. The mulberry flowers are actually these little chains of individual flowers. And then as those flowers mature, all of their individual ovaries fuse together to form a mulberry. So even though a mulberry looks a lot like a blackberry, it's not an aggregate fruit, it's a multiple fruit. Hmm. Here's where things start to get really, really, really weird. Um, we can have fleshy accessory multiple fruits. Fleshy meaning that all the pericarp layers are soft. Accessory meaning that some of the tissue is not true ovary wall. Multiple meaning that the fruit developed from the ovaries of many individual flowers that fuse together during the ripening process. Um, a synconium is a multiple accessory fruit that develops from an inverted inflorescence. And this is the characteristic fruit or inflorescence of figs. So we've talked a lot about Asteraceae and how Asteraceae have numerous tiny florets. So this is the sunflower family. In the sunflower family, in the disc, the central disc of the flower, we actually have tiny, tiny individual flowers. The entire sunflower is not a flower. It's an inflorescence. It's a larger structure bearing the flowers. The florets are those individual tiny flowers in the disc. Um, Imagine that you pushed down on the disc with your thumbs and then used your fingers to pull the edges of the sunflower kind of up and over to close it up like a string bag. That's kind of how a synconium is developed. We've got a flower that's basically been folded in and over it. We've got an inflorescence that's been folded in and over itself. So all of the flowers actually open up to the inside of the synconium. And the only way to access that is through this tiny little tube. Most species of wild figs are actually pollinated by really highly specialized wasps that live their whole life cycle within the fig. Um, and they're some of the only animals that are small enough to actually enter that flower pollen or enter that inflorescence, pollinate the flowers inside, and then all of the ovaries of those individual flowers within the synconium, as they ripen and mature, they'll all fuse together to produce the flesh of one fig fruit. Um, Dehiscent fruits do some interesting things. We're going to start from here on out seeing a lot of fruits that are not maybe what you typically expect to see when you think of a fruit. So these are fruits that split open when they're mature, and they're splitting open to release their seeds. To dehisce means to split open. If you have ever worked in medicine or ever maybe have thought about that or plan to, if you've ever had stitches, what happens sometimes when someone gets a cut and then they get sutures or stitches, um, at the hospital, sometimes those stitches come out and the wound splits open again, even though it was starting to heal. And they call that wound dehiscence. It's a bad thing when in medicine. You don't want the cut that you just stitched closed to rip back open again. But in dehiscent fruited plants, they need their fruit to split open when the fruit is mature in order to release the seeds for them to be dispersed. Um, Usually, these dehiscent fruits dry out, and often it's the act of drying out that causes it to kind of shrink or change shape and split open. Sometimes they just drop their seeds. Sometimes plants with the dehiscent fruits will fling them, catapult them. They might explode or squirt their seeds long distances. We'll talk about some examples as we move forward. One plant I wanted to talk about on this slide is the plant in the bottom right-hand side. This is the yellow water lily, the yellow water lily Nuphar lutea, and it's also called brandy bottle due to the shape of the ovary or the fruit, and it's also called spatterdock because of its behavior when it disperses its seeds. This water lily pumps its fruit so full of liquid that eventually the fruit explodes with the underwater pressure. That flings the seeds, sometimes, you know, many, many feet from the water lily. Um, and then the seeds will actually float for several hours before absorbing enough water that they sink to the bottom, where they can then germinate. And that exploding fruit is actually one of the ways that that plant disperses its own seeds without the need to recruit an animal, which has its own advantages. Certainly, you don't have to worry about someone not showing up to work on the day that you need your seeds dispersed. Our first type of dry dehiscent fruit that we'll talk about are follicles. Um, Follicles are a dry dehiscent fruit which dehisce, or they split open to release their seeds along a single suture. So they just have one opening. And one of my favorite examples is the showy milkweed. This is the plant that we have in the top half of the slide. I've got the flowers there for you. They're gorgeous, and they're an important food source for our monarch butterflies. And then next to the flowers, we see the suture of the milkweed, both closed in the fruit on the left and then split open in the fruit on the right. And we can see that the seeds are starting to catch the wind and blow away out of that dehisced fruit. Um, in the bottom, we see a peony and the peony fruit. And because we have three different ovaries within the flower of a peony, we would actually say that it's an aggregate fruit. We could say that a peony produces a fruit which is an aggregate of follicles, each one splitting open along just one single suture. And in case I didn't say so already, the suture is the seam in a fruit that can split open or dehisce to release the seeds of that plant. Pods or legumes are the same thing. It's your choice which one to use. I will typically, who am I kidding? I switch between the two of them. I use them interchangeably. So pod or legume, that's a dry dehiscent fruit which dehisces along two sutures. And our beans and peas are some of the best examples of this. If you look at the picture in the top, well, the picture's in the top half of the slide. We've got green soybeans that are not fully mature, and then on the other side, we've got a mature soybean that has split open or shattered and released its seeds. And you can see this really distinctive spiral pattern in the way that this pod breaks apart. You see that beans also do that, and in the bottom right corner, the pods of vetch also split into two portions that curl up. By spiraling as they split, plants like vetch or green beans can actually kind of catapult their seeds away from themselves. This isn't a feature that all leguminous plants have or all pod-bearing plants have, but it's certainly a way that they can kind of flick or launch their seeds by rapidly kind of spiraling up when they split open. Some examples of pods that do not dehisce would be peanuts. Peanuts are named for their similarity to peas, like peas in a pod. They're actually in the same family, and a peanut pod does not dehisce along the seams, the two seams that run down the front of the peanut and the back of the peanut. They just stay stuck together. So not all pods or legumes are dehiscent, but certainly most are. Our next type of dry dehiscent fruits are siliques. So this is a dry dehiscent fruit which also dehisces along two sutures, but it also contains this membranous internal divider, which we call a rhiplum. The silique is characteristic of plants in the family Brassicaceae, which is the mustard family. So that includes things like yellow mustard, brown mustard, wasabi, horseradish, radishes, cabbage, broccoli, canola, watercress, rockcress, wallflowers, etc. I mean, I could go on and on and on. It's a huge, huge family of plants, but they all have this feature. And when we think about a silique, when it's closed, that rhiplum inside would really make it so there were two chambers or two locules within the fruit. So we would say that it's a type of fruit that has two locules or two carpels that contributed to the formation of that fruit. If you haven't noticed already, this is going to be a counting game in these dry dehiscent fruits. We're looking at how many sutures they dehisce along. So a follicle dehisces along one suture to release its seeds. A pod dehisces or splits open along two sutures to release its seeds. A silique also splits open along two, but it has a membranous internal divider. And capsules are any dry dehiscent fruit which dehisces along three or more sutures. When we get to the capsule stage, we stop defining the capsule based on the number of sutures, and we start defining them based on their manner of dehissing. If we look at this little chart with the periwinkle background, we can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little diagrams showing different ways that capsules can dehiss or split open. They can be septicidal, meaning that they split open at the septa to release the seeds. They can be loculicidal, meaning that the locules themselves split open to release the seeds. They can be denticidal, where they have little teeth split open to release the seeds. They can be poricidal, meaning that little pores split open to release the seeds. They can be circumscissile, meaning that they split open around the ovary wall to release the seeds. Operculate, meaning that they maybe have a tiny little lid that pops off, or irregular, they can just shatter open as well. And I've got some examples of these different types in the images. On the very top pair of images, we have poppies. And we can see by comparing the fruit, the dried fruit of the poppy to our chart, that a poppy has a poricidal capsule. It has these tiny little windows that open up along the top of the ovary, just underneath the dried up stigma of the flower, and the seeds are free to shake out of there like a baby rattle. Our second two pictures in the middle are of hibiscus. We got this beautiful red hibiscus flower, and next to it, the mature dehissed fruit. And we can see the septa, or the walls, are that were dividing the inside of the fruit are intact. The locules themselves actually split open. So we would say that hibiscus has a loculicidal capsule. On the very bottom, we have datura, and we can see that datura split open along 4 different sutures, and that 2 of those sutures aligned with the septum, or the divider within the fruit, and that 2 of the sutures were just splitting open the locules themselves. So it's kind of an interesting combination where it's both septicidal and loculicidal. Our last major group of fruits are the indehiscent fruits. These are fruits that do not split open or dehiss when they're fully mature. This group of fruits are often, the members of this kind of classification are often mistaken for seeds. You probably have never thought twice about them as seeds, but we're going to learn how and why they are fruit today. We'll look at some examples as we go. Our first type of dry indehiscent fruit is a caryopsis, which is a dry indehiscent fruit in which the pericarp, or the ovary wall, is fused to the underlying seed coat. Great example of this is corn. When you plant a corn seed, you are actually planting the fruit, the dried fruit containing one seed, because the ovary wall, which we call the pericarp, is fused to the underlying seed coat of the seed. You cannot easily remove a corn seed from a corn fruit. Every single individual grain of corn had its own stigma, which we call the silks. So they are all individual fruits containing one single seed, a caryopsis. Our next type of dry indehiscent fruits are the achenes. Achenes are dry indehiscent fruit which contain a seed that fills the pericarp but is not adhered to it. If we look at this little diagram in the bottom left-hand corner, we see a sunflower seed, both illustrated, shelled, and then dissected. And we can see that the pericarp is actually the shell of the sunflower seed. And I say seed with some air quotes around it because the shell is actually the fruit. Those of you who like sunflower seeds and have taken a lot of them apart, I've probably noticed that there's kind of a papery layer that covers the sunflower seed itself. That's actually the seed coat. Because the sunflower plant produces this hard shell-like pericarp around the seed, that's actually allowed the seed coat to become softer and deteriorate because it no longer needs the protection of the seed coat in order to keep the seed from getting damaged. Instead, it's using this dry fruit that does not split open, pardon, it doesn't, sorry. It's using this dry fruit that does not split open to accomplish what the seed coat normally accomplishes. Another good example of an achene would be like a dandelion seed. In this particular situation, we call it a cypsela, which is an achene that has a parachute. And that parachute is made out of the calyx. So if we were to dissect the flower of a dandelion and look at every individual floret, every individual little flower in that floral disc, because it's in the daisy or sunflower family, we would find that the calyx actually develops into that parachute. You might be wondering why I have strawberries on this page, and that's because the actual fruits of the strawberry are the, in air quotes, seeds on the outside. Each little seed covering a strawberry is an achene. It's a dry and dehiscent fruit containing a single strawberry seed. So when we talk about a strawberry seed, we actually have numerous ovaries within the same flower that are maturing, individually. So we would actually say that a strawberry is an aggregate of achenes because it's an aggregate fruit because there are multiple ovaries that are fusing together as the fruit ripens. But the fruit type itself is an achene. So a strawberry is an aggregate of achene, and then the flesh of the strawberry itself is accessory fruit. It's receptacle tissue. Remember that the receptacle is the tissue that all of the other floral parts, all of the other floral whorls are anchored to. And that is the portion that is swelling and filling with sweet juice. So a strawberry is really an unusual situation because it's an aggregate of achenes with a fleshy accessory receptacle that makes up this actual edible portion of the strawberry. Our next type of dry and dehiscent fruit is the samara. The samara is just a winged achene. So we have inside of each winged fruit a kind of a loose seed inside. The fruit itself, the samara, is not fused to the underlying seed like it is in a caryopsis. Some samaras have just one wing, some have two wings or more. Maples are good examples of fruits that have two wings, but they actually split apart, and then each half of the fruit will have just one wing. Elms, which are the little round seeds in the top right corner, they have two wings that are kind of fused together at either end, and they kind of flutter down rather than kind of helicoptering. So samara is a winged achene. A nut is a really fun type of dry indehiscent fruit. All of the layers of the pericarp are all woody in a nut. So we saw that in the drupes, like peaches, just the endocarp, the innermost layer of the ovary wall or pericarp, is woody. But in a nut, all three layers of the ovary wall or pericarp are woody. The endocarp is woody, the mesocarp is woody, and the exocarp is woody. So we have one nut stuck inside of this woody fruit. And if you ever played with acorns as a child under an oak tree, you may have kind of cracked them open and noticed that there's this kind of thick woody shell on the acorn, and that when you bust it open with a rock, you can extract the seed. A lot of people misinterpret the shell of an acorn as a seed coat, but it is actually the fruit. And another fun thing about nuts is that they typically possess an involucre, which is a whorl of bracts. And remember that bracts are just modified leaves that we find in association with reproductive structures like flowers or fruits. When you look at an acorn in this bottom left-hand image, you can see that each acorn has a little cap on it that's composed of what looks like little scales. Each one of those scales is a modified leaf or bract, and all of those modified leaves or bracts are fused together. And when we have a whorl of fused bracts surrounding an inflorescence, we call it an involucre. You can see that hazelnuts in the top right corner also have a papery little hat on them. The chestnut, which has the spiky involucre in the top uh, left corner, also has an involucre. We can see that there are 3 nuts inside, so we could say that a chestnut produces an aggregate of nuts. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we have beech nuts. And beeches are interesting because their involucres actually peel back to release the nuts. And we can see that there's 1 nut inside of this involucre, which is split open. And then we have a couple other involucres or whorls of these modified leaves or bracts that have not yet kind of split open to release um, the nuts. I think this is our last slide. So a schizocarp is any dry indehiscent fruit where the mature fruit breaks apart into several smaller fruits called mericarps. An important distinction to make, you might think because they're breaking apart that they'd really be dehiscent, but dehiscent fruits split open, not apart. When a schizocarp breaks apart, it's not splitting open to release its seeds. The seeds are still firmly contained within the fruit. It's that the fruit has several subunits that can break apart into individual portions in order to help that plant spread its seeds. So when we look at a maple seed or a maple schizocarp, when we look at the fruit of a maple, we see that the fruit or schizocarp actually has 2 wings, two wings. It's a samara, and we've got the 2 seeds inside of that. That fruit will actually split apart into 2 separate little helicopter seeds, or fruits, which will float down to the ground and help that maple tree spread its seeds. Other good examples are mallow, or in the bottom we have puncture vine, goat heads. You can see that the fruit of the puncture vine is composed of 5 mericarps, which probably developed from 5 separate carpels within the pistil. And each of those individual portions can break apart from each other in order to increase the likelihood that that plant will successfully disperse its seeds. So a schizocarp is a dry indehiscent fruit, which when mature breaks apart to form several smaller fruits, which we call mericarps, but it does not split open to release its seeds. Oh, I forgot, we've got a few more slides. We're nearly done. Apomixis is something that I think is really valuable to know about. So here in this top diagram, I have a picture of the ovule, developing within this little embryo sac. And we have kind of 2 different options. We can either make this little embryo sac of the ovule and then some sperm show up in the top path, right? You see that there's 2 different paths in this diagram. In the top path, the egg within the ovule gets fertilized, develops into a zygote and then an embryo, and we get a genetically unique offspring. Or in the bottom half of this diagram, the other route a plant can take is it can actually make vegetative embryos out of purely maternal tissue, out of this little sac that contains the ovule. And those embryos, because they developed from the mother's cells without any pollination or fertilization, they will be clones of the mother plant. This is something that happens really commonly with citrus. Citrus have kind of unusual seeds. They have to be planted immediately after they're removed from the fruit. If you don't plant them immediately, they'll dry out, and if they dry out, they die. Citrus seeds cannot tolerate dehydration the way most other types of seeds can. And if you germinate enough citrus seeds, you'll often get seeds that actually produce multiple seedlings per seed, and that's typically because there were multiple um, embryos that formed from the lining of the sac that the ovule develops in. One of the cool things about these is they're all clones of the mother plant. So if you want to grow orange seeds, there's a good chance that some of the seeds, when they begin to bear fruit, will have the same fruit quality of the mother. And then parthenocarpy is a characteristic we're particularly interested in horticulture. And this is when a fruit develops despite either non-fertilization, faulty fertilization, or the abortion of the developing ovules, which results in a seedless fruit. There are a lot of different mechanisms by which this can happen. Some plants are genetically parthenocarpic and they will fruit regardless of whether there are pollinators. And if they're not pollinated, they will not produce any seeds inside of the fruits. Sometimes we're crossing um, two lineages of a crop that are genetically incompatible. And so there's either non-fertilization or faulty fertilization. That's what causes us to have seedless watermelons. In the situation with seedless watermelons, wild watermelons are diploid, just like human beings are, meaning they've got two copies of every chromosome. You can treat um, watermelon plants with a chemical called colchicine, which comes from crocuses, and it will actually cause their chromosomes to not split apart the way they're supposed to during cell division when the plant is making its eggs and sperm. And then you'll end up with eggs and sperm that actually have two copies of every chromosome. So then when they're fertilized or pollinated, they will produce seeds where the embryo has four copies of every chromosome. When you grow these plants that have four copies of every chromosome, which we call tetraploids, and you cross them back to a plant that only has two copies of every chromosomes, the resulting offspring have three copies of every chromosome, and they're incapable of pollination, sorry, of producing function. They're incapable of producing functional eggs or sperm because you can't divide three chromosomes evenly into two. So during the process of meiosis, they cannot make functional eggs and sperm. If you didn't understand what that's about, just know that there are some watermelons that have twice as much genetic information as other types of watermelons. And if you cross the two together, you get a faulty fertilization and the ovules will abort their development, which results in a seedless fruit. Um, I